Welcome again, and welcome back to our presentation for week 8 on the influence of Europe and international intervention in the region. In this second segment of our presentation, we're going to talk about some of the strategies adopted by internationals to try to promote democratic development in states in the region. I think we can say what's distinctive about the so-called transition in the region of Southeast Europe is that it's occurred since 2000 with sustained oversight and engagement of international institutions and of powerful states. And we can compare this. If the goal of the transition is that the states of the region will join the institutions that unite Europe, compare this to the political changes in the 1970s when military regimes and dictatorships were removed from power in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. There, the number of tests that were faced by the states that wanted to join the European community at the time were relatively simple. They asked, did they have elections? Did they have political parties? Was there a constitution and something that looked like effective rule of law? If the answer was yes, they joined pretty quickly. In the cases of the states of the region, they're faced with a very complex set of conditions which they're expected to meet and a set of institutions overseeing and assessing their compliance, that is with oversight. What kinds of oversight are we talking about? There are two principal forms of oversight. One is, as we see in states like Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, international administration, in which there is oversight of the activities of the state and of state institutions by international bodies. Another strategy that we see this especially in the beginning of the period that we're concerned about, is programs of so-called democracy assistance, that is, ways in which through the investment of money, through the provision of advice and information, through assistance in the reform of structures, international agencies and state-sponsored agencies try to share with the states of the region their understanding of what constitutes democracy, what is democratic practice, and how to achieve it. So let's talk first about international administration. One of the things that we can observe about international administration is that it's unpopular. It's unpopular with the states that sponsor it. It's unpopular in the states where they're active. It's probably unpopular with people who work in the international administrations. So one question we can ask is, why doesn't international administration simply end? Why don't the international administrators simply go away? And all of the people in the agencies engaged in international administration and the states and the interstate organizations that sponsor them will give a more or less similar answer to that question. It's that they would like to go away, but they're afraid of the consequences of what would happen if they did, either the reemergence of authoritarianism and extremism or the reemergence of violence. You can decide for yourself how persuasive you think that that answer is. I think it's possible to make assessments, but what does it mean that they remain, that they don't go away? Well, one of the things that it probably means is that to the degree that political institutions are unresponsive and resistant to change in these states, they're likely to continue to be that way because responsibility for change is not in their hands. Second, in states like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where international agreements have imposed constitutional and political structures in which power is shared on the basis of ethnicity, there is an emphasis on ethnic avenues to political power, with the unintended, probably unintended result that while some forms of nationalism are seen as the basic problem, one of the causes behind conflict in these states and in the region, it's in fact made stronger and entrenched by becoming a fundamental part of the system. Third, we see the creation of a class of people, a group of professionals who become clients of the international administration. And this includes not only politicians and various types of experts and specialists, but a group of people who serve them, people in capacities like translators and drivers, who, because of higher pay and other conditions, come to take on positions in the society that are probably inconsistent with ones that are usually held by members of those professions. Fourth, you see the distortion of markets for expertise and for labor because of the competition that exists between domestic and international institutions, with the international institutions more complexly organized and better financed than the domestic ones. And of course, there's the most obvious result of them staying, and that is that that the oversight that we talk about continues. That is, that there remains an international force with some degree of authority. It tends to vary over the decisions that are made in the state. Now, we can say then that the peace agreements and other agreements, the post-regime changes in Southeast Europe, are definitely not the first political transitions to occur in history. They are not the first post-war or post-conflict accommodations to occur in history. What makes them unique is the degree of international oversight and control. And we can say some things about the international administration that is imposed, that this can be thought of as a kind of intervention, but it is intervention that is structured according to not necessarily a long-term military or political strategy, but according to an ideological practice, that is according to a set of standards that are conceived more or less abstractly, according to goals like peace, democracy, reconciliation, and so on. What we can say then, the second point here, is similar to the first one, but it's that oversight is maintained not for an explicitly material purpose, but for what's seen to be a political purpose. And a third observation that we can make about international intervention is that there is not a clear conception of when the goals of intervention will have been achieved, how this will be measured, or what happens afterward. And so whether this is intended or not, the intervention tends to sustain itself. This leads to the deepening of a number of dilemmas. And I would highlight three of those dilemmas. The first dilemma is, while the stated goal of most of the interventions is the construction of democracy, democratic control would be threatening to some of the other purposes of intervention. It would be contrary to policy principles and may also be dangerous. What we're talking about there is that the people organizing international administration are afraid that in fair and open elections, parties would win that would contribute to the regeneration of conflict. A second dilemma. These interventions occur in the region where states have an interest in the affairs of neighboring states. They have an interest in the political outcomes that are produced in internationally administered areas. And this interest tends to feed non-democratic or anti-democratic populism in these neighboring states. This is clearest if we take Bosnia and Herzegovina as an example, where both Serbia and Croatia act as guarantors of the peace agreement of which the international administration is a part. And as the guarantors, they are also interested in strengthening the relative autonomy and in feeding national sentiment in the areas where members of co-ethnic groups form a majority. Third, the mutual interests of states in the region, and all of the states in the region do have some level of mutual interest, come into conflict with the issues on which they have opposing positions. And this is partly the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and probably even more the case in states like Kosovo. These issues on which they conflict include the status of these states themselves, the degree of their independence, or even the fact of their independence. For example, let's move on to talk a little bit about democracy assistance. What is democracy assistance? This is essentially a set of programs which is provided as a form of aid by powerful international states, with the idea that their adoption is going to promote democratic ideas and democratic practices in the countries that are the targets. Now, for the European Union, most of the assistance that is provided to the states of the region comes in the form of development assistance. building schools, hospitals, roads, this kind of thing. Um, but but to the degree that European assistance is political in character, a lot of it is concentrated on political institutions. That is on political party development, on development of relations between political parties in Europe and political parties in the candidate states, and on election monitoring. These are mostly administered through an organization called the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Now, the United States is another story. I should say, wherever the United States intervenes in terms of development assistance or in terms of democracy assistance, because of the size of the budgets that it provides, it is the largest actor in the places where it intervenes. During the interesting several years when Donald Trump was president in the United States, there was a declining interest in democracy assistance, but otherwise the United States is fairly active, and it's active through the largest agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, but also through the Office of Transition Initiatives, and it subcontracts activity through institutions that are officially a part of the major political parties in the United States, the International Republican Institute and the International Democratic Institute. In general, the highest priority of the United States is in projects for development rather than projects for the promotion of democracy. There's a tendency on the part of USAID to regard promotion of democracy as impossible to measure and vague. But to the degree that the United States does engage in democratic assistance, there are some interesting correspondences because policy and practices tend to change with changes of administration. And in particular, they changed right about the time that regimes were changing on a large scale in the region around 2000, when a Republican administration came into power in the United States. So you have these Republicans, people from the political right in the United States, where there is an ideological perspective that is anti-bureaucratic, anti-state, and they have ideas about what constitutes democracy that are in a way kind of radical. They're ideas that are never implemented in the countries where these parties are in fact in power, but they try to apply them in other countries. And one of the ideas is that government, bureaucracy, political parties are simply interference. This is consistent with the small government slogan of the American right, slogans like government is the problem. So they have this interest in direct democracy in which communities organize themselves and bypass political institutions and political parties. One of the things that is very strange about this around 2001, when the United States starts coming in large measure to provide democratic assistance in the states of Southeast Europe, they begin studying the history and institutions in the region, and they develop this tremendous fondness for the self-managed socialism system that developed in Yugoslavia during the communist period, because they said this was a way in which citizens, by being directly involved, can bypass bureaucracies and political parties. And they developed a program to implement this. This is a program that was first pioneered in Lebanon, and the person who pioneered these programs in Lebanon became the director of the AID democracy assistance programs in Serbia, but his agency was active also in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Montenegro. A fellow by the name of James Stevenson, who was nicknamed Spike, even though he is neither a wrestler nor a jazz musician. What he developed in Lebanon was something he called community development clusters. That was a program in which members of a local community, a town or a village, would decide what the needs are in the community, put out a proposal for meeting that need, and then half or something close to half of the money would be provided by USAID, and the other half was expected to be raised by the communities themselves. Now, this appeared to be a successful system in Lebanon, and fundamentally, it was transplanted to the states of ex-Yugoslavia through the program Community Development through Democratic Action. Uh, and this was a program in which the idea was that communities themselves would engage in these projects to meet their needs and in the context build democratic practices and institutions, learn about procurement practices like open bidding and so forth, and bypass the political parties that controlled this kind of development. The effects of it in practice were a bit different because political parties tended to control all of the institutions through which these community development activities had to work, and there were some ways of avoiding political influence that seem familiar to people from the communist period. So that, for example, in the communist period, when there was an expectation that half or 40% of all of the members of decision-making bodies would be women, this was an instrument that was used by men in control of political institutions to fill these spaces with women who were their relatives or wives or neighbors or close associates whose votes they could control. Something similar happened in these community development clusters where political parties simply acted through their agents to make it appear as though political parties were not controlling the activity. So the effects of democracy assistance were uneven, were sometimes unanticipated, probably because of an incomplete understanding of the process that was being engaged. So what can we say about democratic assistance generally? We'd say overall, and these are small programs. The democracy assistance programs that are engaged are much smaller than development programs. Their contribution to the development of democracy was uneven and sometimes, in a way, negative. Um, Probably for the states providing the means through which assistance is provided, um, the focus is not so much on building democratic values or practices or institutions, but more projecting influence of the state in the states that are the target. That is through a strategy that sometimes goes by the label of soft power.